Hello photographers, my name is Spyros Heniadis and this is where I answer your photography questions and we learn about photography together. And today we are learning about the Fuji X-T1 mirrorless camera. The X-T1 was announced on January 28th, 2014 and is Fuji's flagship camera in their X system series. And as we're recording this video, the body of the X-T1 sells for $1,150 and it sells for $1,450 with the 18 to 55 millimeter kit lens. The X-T1 has a 16 megapixel APS-C sized X-Trans sensor with no AA filter. It uses the EXR processor 2 image engine. It has a 3-inch 1.4 million dot tilting LCD screen that is not a touch screen. It weighs 440 grams, has a single SD card slot, is weather sealed, has Wi-Fi, and of course an electronic viewfinder. The viewfinder gives you 100% coverage with a 0.77x magnification. The camera has an ISO range of 200 to 6400 with an extended ISO range of 100 to 51,200. It's got a shutter speed of 30 seconds to 1/4000th of a second, and it can shoot up to 8 frames per second. It's got all of the standard Fujifilm film simulations and a built-in intervalometer for time-lapse shooting. Of the X series, the X-T1 has the most robust video features, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Starting with the design, in the X-T1 we have a pretty sexy camera. It's in keeping with Fuji's retro style design, but this is the first SLR styled body which breaks from the rangefinder mold that all of the previous X series cameras have used. The X-T1 has a magnesium alloy body that is dust and water resistant and is rated to be able to work in temperatures as low as -10 Celsius. As I said, it weighs just 440 grams. However, if you shoot with the new 16 to 55 millimeter Pro lens, you're going to lose any weight advantage gained by using this nice little body. Now, for me, the weight of this lens here isn't a problem, but if part of the reason you're going to Fuji is the size and weight, then you're going to want to skip this big Pro lens and either use the kit zoom lens or the excellent Fuji prime lenses. On the front of the camera is a very nice grip hump, a control dial for changing the shutter speed in 1/3 stops, the AF assist, a customizable function button, the lens release, the focus mode switch, and a PC sync port. On top are Fuji's signature physical control knobs for all of your major functions. Starting at the left, you have the ISO knob, and underneath the ISO knob is the drive mode switch. And a word about the ISO knob, it's locked, which means you need to hold down this plunger button on top in order to turn the dial. If you don't, you can't turn the dial. And I understand that this is to prevent accidental ISO changes, but this is something that I really don't like because it makes changing the ISO when you're holding the camera up to your eye really pretty awkward because you got to hold the button and spin the dial rather than just being able to grab it and spin it. Now, next to the ISO knob is the viewfinder with the diopter adjuster. On top of the viewfinder hump is the flash hot shoe, and on the right side of the viewfinder hump is the view mode selector button. Then we have the shutter speed knob with the metering mode switch underneath it, and the shutter speed knob changes freely in full stop increments, but it locks when you put it in auto, which makes it inconvenient if you want to go directly from your highest to your lowest shutter speeds. It locks here, which is kind of crappy. Next to the shutter knob, you have the shutter button and the power switch. We have the customizable Wi-Fi function button, the exposure compensation knob, and the record button for video mode. On the back is the tilting LCD with the trash and image review buttons above it. On the right, we have the exposure lock and focus lock buttons, which are separated by the rear control dial. The rear control dial allows you to change the size of the autofocus point when selecting your focus point, and it allows you to change the quick menu options when in the menu. To the right of the LCD is the focus assist button, the quick menu button, the directional pad with the display button below it, and the thumb grip. Now, the X-T1, like other mirrorless cameras, offers a great deal of customization with 6 fully customizable buttons and several other customizable options. The fully customizable buttons are the front, Wi-Fi, and the 4 directional pad buttons. And what's really neat is how easy it is to change the function of any of these buttons. All you need to do is press and hold the button down, and after a few seconds, it will bring up the customization menu for that button, and then you can change the function just like that. The focus lock and exposure lock buttons can have their functions flipped, and the control dials can also have their functions flipped. And if you set the shutter speed knob to the T, then the front dial controls the shutter speed through the entire range instead of just the 1/3 stop increments around the particular shutter speed you've got selected selected on the knob. And this is a welcome addition to the camera. One of the things I did not care for on the other X series cameras was having to change the shutter speed with two different controls, using the dial and the control dial. Having the full range of shutter speeds available in one single control point is really, really nice. And then finally, like all other X series cameras, you change the aperture using the aperture ring on the lens. And the X-T1 is a beautifully designed camera. The only real issue I have with the design is the fully locked ISO button and then having the shutter knob locked when you're in auto. And really, that's a preference. Some people really like the locked dials, but beyond the locked dial issue, this camera is beautifully designed. It's light, it's very easy to hold, and it puts every major control point right at your fingertips. Now, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about image quality because this is pretty well covered ground. In short, the images that come out of the X-T1 are fantastic. They're really fantastic. They are nice and sharp, which of course is as much about the lens as it is the camera. The colors are beautiful, and frankly, I love the images that come out of this camera. I do want to talk a little bit about the ISO performance, starting with ISO 6400, which in my opinion is great. Here's a shot from a bar band test, and as you can see, it looks great, and I personally would have no problem shooting this camera at ISO 6400. Now, I mentioned earlier the extended ISOs of 100 and 12,800 to 51,200. One thing you need to know is that when you shoot in these extended ISOs, you cannot capture the images in RAW. The camera automatically defaults to JPEGs, which is a little bit disappointing. With that being said, the noise at ISO 12,800 is still not bad at all, and I personally would be fine using 12,800, although I would prefer it was a RAW file instead of a JPEG. At 25,600, things really start to fall apart, and I would shoot with this in a pinch, but I definitely wouldn't use it regularly. And when we get to ISO 51,200, things are really degraded. So for me, 51,200 would be emergency use only, like if I had no other choice. Also, something to note, when you shoot at ISO 51,200, there's a processing delay of about 1 second after every photo you take, which will definitely slow down your shooting. Overall, as expected, the X-T1 produces beautiful images across its entire native ISO range, and this is no surprise as these cameras are already well known for this. So now let's talk about the autofocus. Everyone knows that the early Fuji X cameras were not so great at focusing, and Fuji has clearly been putting a lot of work into improving this. The X-T1 uses a combination of contrast and phase detection for focusing, and all of the focus points are on the sensor. It has 49 autofocus points that cover nearly the entire image area. And by default, you can hit the down directional pad button to activate focus point selection, and then you can use the directional pad to select the different point that you want to use. And when shooting with the X-T1, I did not have any serious focus issues. The X-T1, like the EM5 II, occasionally misses focus, but when it does, it misses so bad that it's absolutely clear that you need to refocus. And outside of those occasional misses, the autofocus was really fantastic. Now, as I was reviewing the camera, Fuji released the brand new 4.0 firmware for the X-T1, adding the zone and wide tracking modes that were introduced on the X-T10. What I did to test these focusing modes was head down to the river to try shooting the ducks. And if you want to really test your camera's tracking ability, try taking photos of a flock of ducks descending on a bunch of bread. You'll really see what your camera is capable of. In this case, the X-T1's performance was really impressive. I was actually a little bit shocked at how good it was. Now, in this sequence here, I didn't focus on a single subject. Instead, I wanted to see how the tracking would just respond to all of the activity, and in my opinion, it handled it really well. With all of the ducks, I did not expect it to track a single one of them, so you're going to notice that the focus changes ducks as they move throughout the focus area. But what it's doing is really tracking the movement and grabbing a subject and locking onto it pretty reliably. Now, in this next sequence, I went with a single subject, and you can see that it tracked the duck pretty well. And like with any tracking system, there were misses, but overall, I felt that it did a really impressive job tracking the focus of the moving subject. And in low light, the X-T1 also held its own. Focusing in low light is a challenge for any camera, so I don't expect any of them to be perfect. And with focus tracking, it wasn't. But when I put the X-T1 through my bar band test, it gave me consistent focus results, which is really what I was looking for. And one of the nice things about Fuji's system is that you can change the size of the focus point, which makes it more likely to get good focus lock when you're in a difficult focus situation. Now, finally, before moving on, I want to mention the burst mode of the camera. It's rated at 8 frames per second. Now, it's not the fastest camera in the world in terms of burst mode, but 8 frames per second is pretty respectable. I found that when shooting full-size, high-quality JPEGs, the camera would get off around 30 photos before the buffer filled up. And if you shoot in RAW, that drops to around 20 photos, and then your buffer is full. It's really not a very big buffer, and when I was testing, the limitation presented itself pretty quickly. What I found is that I'd end up sitting a fair amount of time waiting for the buffer to clear after I burst off those 20 or 30 shots while I was shooting the ducks. So it's certainly possible to shoot sports and action with the X-T1, but with the buffer, it's definitely not going to be the best choice. Now I want to talk about the electronic viewfinder. The viewfinder resolution is 2.36 million dots, and it's really a beautiful viewfinder. One of the genius things about this viewfinder is that when you put the camera into portrait mode, the information display in the viewfinder flips to keep everything upright, so you don't have to look crosswise to see what your settings are. There's virtually no lag when you use this viewfinder, and like other electronic viewfinders, there are manual focus aids. Focus peaking is pretty common, and Fuji also offers a digital split image. Now, both of these tools are fantastic to use in good lighting conditions, and initially I was super excited to use these focusing aids. But when I tried to use focus peaking to manually focus in low light, my experience changed dramatically. What I discovered is that in low light, both the focus peaking and the digital split image are incredibly difficult to use. One of the great things about an electronic viewfinder is that it can allow you to see in the dark. It does this by boosting the viewfinder signal so that even if the scene you're looking at is really dark to the naked eye, you can see what it looks like in the viewfinder. But when you boost that signal, you get noise in the viewfinder, just like you get noise when you boost the ISO of your images. And this by itself isn't terrible, and under normal shooting with autofocus, the X-T1's viewfinder is fantastic in low light. But in my experience, when you put the camera into manual focus and you use focus peaking or the split image, the viewfinder becomes almost impossible to use. First, when using focus peaking, the viewfinder gets these sparklers. It looks like static or snow on a TV screen. And these sparklers make looking through the viewfinder really hard, and after too long trying to use manual focus, the sparklers actually started to give me a headache. In addition to the sparklers, the focus peaking is incredibly difficult to see, and the split image wasn't much better. With the split image, the noise is so amplified that it made it incredibly difficult to tell if your image was aligned and in focus. Now, if you don't ever intend to use manual focus, this is nothing that you need to worry about. As I said, the viewfinder in low light is really great, and if you're using autofocus, it's not a big deal. And overall, the viewfinder is nothing short of fantastic. But if you're looking to use manual focus lenses, old lenses like your old Canon FD lenses or your Nikon F-mount lenses or those old M42 lenses, and you shoot in low light, this is something that you're going to want to be aware of and test out to see how it works for you. Now we're going to move on to the video, and the X-T1 is the first Fuji X camera to take video more seriously, but Fuji still seems to be pulling their punches here. With the 4.0 firmware update, the X-T1 can shoot in full HD 1080p and 720p at 60, 50, 30, 25, and 24 frames per second. The camera's onboard mic is a stereo mic, and it has a microphone input that is also stereo. And the camera does offer mic levels controls, but it's pretty limited with an adjustment range of just 4 volume steps. Now the control scheme on the X-T1 is a bit different from your normal video mode. The X-T1 doesn't actually have a video mode like we're used to on other cameras, where you switch from photo mode into a video or a live view mode, where you then have access to all of your video settings and menus. Instead, you always have access to all of your video controls, and when you're ready to record a video, you just press the dedicated red record button and you start recording. So when you press that button, you're instantly recording. What that means is before you ever hit this button, you're going to want to set your exposure, you're going to want to lock your focus, set the mic levels, the focus mode, the white balance, and anything else you want set on the camera before you record. Once you're recording, you can change your aperture and your shutter speed, but you cannot change your ISO or any other settings, and you cannot autofocus the camera. If you have the camera set to continuous focus, it will focus while recording, but you don't have any control over what it's focusing on. The only way to control focus while recording is to manually focus yourself, but you do not get focus peaking while shooting video. The quality of the video is okay. It's not anywhere near great, and the bottom line is that for Fuji, video is still mostly an afterthought. It's suitable for casual use, but that's about it. Lastly, before we wrap up, I wanted to talk about the Wi-Fi and the apps that you can use with the Wi-Fi. There are 3 Fuji smartphone apps available to use with the X-T1. They are the Fujifilm photo receiver, the Fujifilm camera remote, and the Fujifilm camera apps. And overall, I was pretty disappointed with the Wi-Fi and the app performance with the X-T1. I tried countless times to connect both the Fujifilm camera remote and the Fujifilm camera apps, and I was never able to get either one of them to connect with the camera. I tried all sorts of troubleshooting, I Googled for solutions, I tried all kinds of different things, and despite my best efforts, I was never able to get either of those apps to connect with the camera. So I have no idea how well the apps work or how well the remote control camera functions in the app works. My suspicion is that the connection problem is with those specific apps because I was able to get the Fujifilm photo receiver app connected on the very first try, and it connected every time I used it afterwards. And the photo receiver app is great for downloading photos, though the operation is a little bit odd. Typically, you browse and download the photos through the app on your device. But with the Fuji photo receiver app, you go through the photos on the camera and send them to the phone using the camera. So the app really just acts as a conduit, and all of the operation actually takes place on the camera. Now, this worked really great. I was just surprised at how it worked because I'm so used to doing it in-app. And I can see the reasoning behind this because if you browse through the phone app, then the app has to pull the previews from the camera through the Wi-Fi connection to the phone, and that's going to slow everything down. With this setup, you browse the photos on the camera, so there's no lag while you're browsing, and the only data that's sent from the camera to the phone is the photos that you tell it to send. Now, overall, I was disappointed in the Wi-Fi because of the connection problems with the other apps. Sending photos to the camera was a breeze, but nothing else worked. All right, so let's wrap this up. All in all, the Fuji X-T1 is a superb camera, especially if you don't really care about video. Like other cameras in the X series, the images that come out of this camera are fantastic, even at the highest native ISO of 6400. It focuses really great in good light and in low light, and the new tracking focus added with the 4.0 firmware works really well. The viewfinder is fantastic in any lighting condition when you use autofocus. It's a small, light camera, and it maintains that profile if you use the excellent Fuji prime lenses or the kit zoom lens. It's got all of the control you need right at your fingertips. It produces beautiful JPEGs with the film simulations, and it gets fantastic long-term support with Fuji's dedication to firmware updates. So if you've been waiting for Fuji's cameras to come of age, as it were, then the X-T1 is probably the camera for you. The main drawbacks of this camera are the low light performance of the viewfinder when manually focusing, the average camera buffer, and the mediocre video. And really, this speaks to who this camera is aimed at. This is not a camera that's aimed at action and sports photographers. It's definitely not a camera aimed at video shooters. This is a camera aimed at photographers with a capital P, and that means whatever you want it to mean. So if you like having a bounty of control at your fingertips and you want a camera that produces beautiful images, if you want to shoot JPEGs and know that they'll come right out of your camera looking beautiful, and if you want a light camera with a superb set of prime lenses to accompany it, then this is your camera. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this review of the Fuji X-T1, and if you have any questions about this camera, leave them down in the comments. And then do me a favor, would you like this video and subscribe to my channel if you really like this video, maybe share it with your friends, but the most important thing you need to do is get out there with whatever camera you've got and take some damn photos. I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Even at the highest ISO of